When someone asks you, what do you do? What do you tell them? Maybe you pause for a moment, searching for the right words. I'm a photographer, or videographer, you say with a hint of uncertainty. But that's not quite right. You're not just a photographer. You're an artist, a creative force. So you tell them, I make things, but even that falls short. You do so much more than that. You're not just a name or a face on social media. You tell stories and you bring ideas to life. You inspire others with the things that you create. Finding the right words is hard because there are so many things that you do. You create to push the boundaries. You create to capture beauty and emotion, to record history and envision the future. You create to make a difference. You are a content creator. That was so cinematic. And I can actually use that word because you may have noticed today we're shooting on a cinema lens, but it's not just any cinema lens, it's an anamorphic cinema lens. Now, one of the key giveaways that I was shooting on an anamorphic lens is the distortion and the lens flares that come along with this lens, but I'm gonna talk about that in a bit. For now, I wanna dive a little bit into what it means to use an anamorphic lens and why you'd even wanna use one in the first place. So this is the Sirui 35mm Venus anamorphic T2.9 1.6 times anamorphic lens. That is a mouthful. Now, a lot of the times video fakes an anamorphic lens, and that's when you get the black bars on the top and the bottom. But when you have a lens like this, it actually allows you to capture super wide photos and videos like what you saw in the intro. That's not me adding black bars, that's actually what this lens captures. And it captures it because it has optical elements inside the lens that take what you would normally get and capture just a little bit more, but then squish it down so that it fits onto the camera sensor of, a full frame camera or whatever type of camera that you're shooting on. Now, if we back up even farther, anamorphic lenses were invented to shoot originally with film cameras. And if you know anything about film and 35mm film, the dimensions are a 3:2 aspect ratio, or about 36mm by 24mm. So with an anamorphic lens, most of them are about a 1.33 times factor. This one, as I mentioned, is a 1.6. But if you take 1.3 and you apply that to film, now your aspect ratio goes from 3:2 and stretches out to 2:1. On the other hand, if you apply a 1.33 anamorphic lens to a standard digital camera, which shoots video at 16:9, now your video stretches out to roughly 2.35 or 2.39:1. So I'll put that on the screen to show you how much wider it gets, but with a 1.6, we're even wider than that. And in this case, we're at about a 2.8:1 ratio. So essentially, you get more field of view. You basically take what is a 35mm lens and are able to capture more like what's a 24 or a 20mm lens. Now, I actually heard a rumor, and I don't know if this is true, but if you know, let me know in the comments down below, but anamorphic lenses were apparently invented so that they could fit more people in a movie theater. Now, if you think about it, a regular 3:2 picture isn't that wide, but if you stretch that out, all of a sudden you can fit more seats in the movie theater and make more money. I don't know if that's true. I heard a rumor, comment down below. Now, one of the byproducts of the anamorphic lens are the lens flares and the optical distortions, and you can see that in some of the footage that I was shooting. Now, the entire video that you saw at the beginning was shot on the anamorphic lens, except for one shot, which was the drone shot, because if you know, I actually crashed my drone at the end of last year. pretty much filming in the exact same place, you can watch that video here. But I was able to include drone footage from Artlist Max, and I wanna show you how I incorporated that into my video timeline. If we jump into the video timeline, this is what it looks like. So not only was I able to use Artlist to grab stock footage of a winter forest and add in some film burns and snow overlays, but I also took advantage of their library of music and sound effects to really build out the sound design of this video. So I layered 2 different songs and about a dozen different sound effects like bass hits and whooshes and then ambient forest noises just to fill out the sound and really add to the storytelling of this video. Now, the lens flares are not from Artlist, but Artlist does have anamorphic lens overlays if you want that fake anamorphic lens look. So the point is that with one service, you can get all of your assets in one place. Your footage, your music, your sound effects, all of that to enhance your storytelling. Or in my case, to replace the drone that you crashed into a tree. So if you want to support me and use the same music and footage and template service that I do to enhance your storytelling, Artlist is the sponsor of today's video, and they've so generously provided a link in the description below, which you can use to sign up for up to 2 months free off of your Artlist subscription. Now, you know that we focus both on photo and video on this channel, so a question some of you may have is, can you use an anamorphic lens to shoot photos? And the answer is kind of. There are some disadvantages to this lens that make it difficult to shoot traditional portraits, particularly the fact that it is a super wide image. So if you're going to take still photos with it, they kind of turn out looking like stills from a movie, which may or may not work for the types of photos and portraits that you're wanting to shoot. Which brings us to the disadvantages of this lens when you compare it to a more traditional spherical lens like the 15-35. This is gonna be a lot more suitable if you wanna shoot in portrait orientation, whereas with the anamorphic lens, if you try to shoot in portrait orientation, you're basically gonna have this really thin strip of a portrait that maybe doesn't work for what you're trying to do. Now, one of the other disadvantages of the Sirui is that it has a pretty far minimum focusing distance. Like on it, you can see that it has a 3 foot or a 0.9 meter minimum focusing distance, which is about that much. And the lens is a cinema lens, which means it's fully manual. Now you can probably see that it's got the gears on it. One is for the focus ring and the other is for the aperture ring. When you connect this lens to your camera, there is no digital connection. There's no digital contacts on the back, which means that the camera doesn't actually know that it's attached. So you have to go into your camera and tell it to release the shutter without a lens attached in order to take any photos or videos. I will say shooting in manual is a little bit of an acquired skill. I'm just so used to these high-tech modern lenses that have image stabilization, autofocus, and these digital control rings, whereas this is completely manual. Now that may or may not work for you. Sometimes it can be super fun to grab some of these older camera lenses and just throw them on your camera and try focusing to see how good of a job you can do compared to the autofocus system. Admittedly, this camera lens is a little bit tricky to use. And we talked about that 1.6 times squish factor. This is basically what it looks like on the back screen or through the viewfinder of your camera, which means if you're editing videos inside of your editing software, you have to scale it horizontally or squish it down vertically in order to make it look normal. Or if you're in Lightroom, you can't even de-squeeze it inside of Lightroom, which means you have to take each of the photos individually, export it to Photoshop, and then stretch it out there and then re-import it to Lightroom in order to edit it in a regular looking way. Now, all of these disadvantages might not matter considering the cost of this lens, which is actually relatively affordable at only $1,500 US. Now, before you freak out, most anamorphic lenses are 2 to 3 times more expensive. We're talking $3,000 plus. The Sirui really is a budget-friendly, entry-level anamorphic lens that kind of gets your foot wet and allows you to experiment a little bit with anamorphic lenses without having to go super crazy with super expensive lenses. Even if you compare it to something like this 15 to 35 RF lens, this is twice as expensive. It has image stabilization, it has autofocus motors, The aperture has a motor. This lens has absolutely no motor. So you're kind of sacrificing all those little modern conveniences like the automatic features that my RF lenses have to really have a nice quality, unique lens in a relatively affordable package. I'm gonna talk really quickly about the build quality. I do think it's a well-built lens. I have no complaints about it. It has an 82mm thread compared to the other anamorphic lens that Sirui makes. That's, I believe, a 58mm thread. Personally, I'd rather have a lens that has this form factor with the larger threads, so I don't have to adapt my ND filters and kind of buy weird adapters. I can just use the lens filters that I already have. When it comes to artifacts and lens distortion inside of this lens, we know that this lens creates lens flares. Now, it wasn't as easy to create the lens flares as I thought it would be. It actually really only happened around either super bright light sources or when I had a really high amount of contrast in my scene, like in some of these night photos where we're holding the light and then everything else is pitch dark. And then when it comes to the bokeh and the background artifacts, I actually had a hard time getting really distinct bokeh. And again, that's because we're looking at a minimum focus distance that's 3 feet. And so I wasn't really in a situation where I had background elements that were glowing or lighting up. But if you do, what you can expect is to get aspherical bokeh elements. So they're not circles like you would get on other camera lenses. They're actually these like cat's eye oval shapes. And then another thing is the bowing or the warping that occurs at the edges of the frame. Now again, this is a feature of the stretching of the anamorphic footage, but essentially what happens is straight lines kind of get bowed out. It's not so obvious when we're shooting in the forest, but in these photos where there's a frame and something in the background with straight lines, it's a lot more obvious. Another thing to worry about is image stabilization. Now, in my case, I actually used a cage with a handle so that I had multiple points of contact and was able to keep my footage a little bit more steady. In some cases, I used warp stabilization on some of my footage, but in others, you'll notice that when I paired the anamorphic lens with the camera, you kind of got some edge shearing. Like edge shearing? No, edge shearing. It's kind of like someone was taking the edges of the frame and shearing it back and forth or shaking it a little bit. And unfortunately, that is unavoidable regardless of what camera system you're shooting on, because the image stabilization inside of these cameras is designed to work with the RF lenses. And if you're shooting Sony, it's designed to work with the Sony lenses. It's just kind of an accepted artifact of this type of shooting. So who is this lens for? Well, who it's not for is short form content creators. And that's because if you're shooting short form, you have to shoot vertically, whereas this lens is really optimized for anyone who wants to shoot horizontally. I do think it's possible to use it for creative photo shoots, but just keep in mind that minimum focus distance, you can't get super up close and personal with any sort of details. If you're someone who is a video first shooter and you want to try something different and you've been thinking about getting into anamorphic camera lenses, this really is the best option now in the market. It's way more affordable than other options. And if you do want to overcome the limits of the minimum focusing distance, I think you should probably pick it up with something like a 50mm or a 100mm anamorphic lens. That way you can swap back and forth from a wide shot on the 35 to a more tight telephoto shot on something like a 100mm lens. If you want to learn more about anamorphic lenses, I've actually linked a handful of resources down in the description below next to my link for 2 months of art list. So if you want to support me, grab some music and some video footage for yourself, check that out, or consider subscribing. And if you do, I'll see you in the next one. This is an anamorphic lens. This is a normal lens. Anamorphic, normal, anamorphic, normal. All right, I'm crazy. I'm going crazy.